Hi, welcome everybody to our event today, Unlocking Canada's Clean Growth Opportunity, Agriculture and Agri-Food, which is the launch of SPI's new report, Clean Growth in Canada's Agriculture and Agri-Food sector. My name is Mike Moffat, Senior Director here at the Smart Prosperity Institute, and I will be the moderator for today's event. I'd like to begin the event with a land acknowledgement. So I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous people of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today virtually, I would like to acknowledge the importance of the lands that we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their culture. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we can each try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So our event today, we're going to have some introductory remarks by Assistant Deputy Minister Tom Rosser. We have then transitioned into a presentation from Ryan Tugas-Cook outlining the report. We'll have a question and answer section with our panelists, and we'll leave some time, about 15 minutes, for audience Q&A. So some housekeeping items. So for our question protocol, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be aggregating all the questions and focusing on the ones that are most commonly asked. You should know that this session is being recorded, and this event will be recorded and available on SPI's YouTube channel. So I would like to introduce Assistant Deputy Minister Tom Rosser. So Tom is the Assistant Deputy Minister of the Market and Industry Services Branch at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. His responsibilities include trade negotiations, agriculture and agri-food sectoral competitiveness, and department regional offices. So I will pass the floor to Tom Rosser. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Mike, and good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. I trust you can hear me okay. Really excited to be a part of this. Excited to learn more about the report. It seems particularly timely to be gathered today as the COP26 is taking place in Glasgow, and maybe I'll just begin by offering a couple of thoughts. I think Mike and Stuart, it's been a couple of years since the Smart Prosperity Institute became heavily engaged in agriculture and agri-food issues, and it seems to me as time goes by that the idea of having exactly that, a focus on smart prosperity in the agri-food sector, seems all the more apt. Maybe I'll start with the smart part, or the prosperity part rather, of smart prosperity. I think it's widely recognized that a huge opportunity, huge economic opportunity lies ahead for Canada in the global agri-food sector. This is something that numerous advisory groups that the government has established have recognized, and the government itself has adopted an export target for the sector in recognition of this opportunity. Many of you will have heard things said before along the lines of the world will need more food in the next 40 years than is produced in the preceding 10,000. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why Canada is uniquely placed to seize that opportunity and helping to feed a growing global population. At the same time, the imperative of doing so in a sustainable manner becomes increasingly apparent. This isn't just because of targets that are under discussion in Ottawa or Glasgow or wherever it may be, but increasingly the imperatives of the market. We see, it seems like almost every week, that whether it's banks and financial institutions, retailers, food processors, major buyers of agricultural products, including and consumers around the world. There's sort of a daily growing evidence to show how seriously they take the sustainability attributes of the products that they purchase and consume. Agriculture is a sector with a significant environmental footprint. It's about 10% of emissions in Canada. I think, depending on how you count, the figure is even higher globally. And it's a challenging sector to address environmental issues in. When we are talking about agriculture in Canada, primary agriculture, we're not talking about a handful of facilities. We're talking about 194,000 different farms across the country with very different realities, and finding ways for government to give producers and farmers the tools they need to prosper while also reducing their environmental footprint is a really significant public policy challenge. We've long had policy tools that are designed to help producers and other actors in the value chain do just that, but we know there's an opportunity to become much smarter about it, much more targeted in the way that we measure costs and benefits and incentivize improved environmental performance. I notice that the time is marching on with me, perhaps marching on me. I just make one other point that, of course, good public policy in this space isn't just about costs and benefits. It's about nudging people, encouraging people to experiment, to try different things, and getting the right mix of educational tools and peer support to not just put incentives in front of producers, but rather work with them to try different things and sometimes take risks to improve the environmental performance of their operations is a big part of the policy challenge in an area that where the unique niche occupied by Smart Prosperity is really well placed to make a contribution. So looking forward to the rest of the seminar, and thanks for your attention.
Well, thank you for those kind words, Tom. We at SPI we really value our relationship with AFC, and we feel what we can add to this is be a convener, an honest broker, and use our capacity here at the Smart Prosperity Institute, where we have the policy shop, we have our academic network, and we have our leaders initiative, and we can all sort of come together between government and industry and academia to try and meet our shared goals. And we are named Smart Prosperity for that we are focused in equal balance on those questions of prosperity and environmental performance. So I'd like to use this moment to introduce Stuart Elgie, our executive chair here at SPI. And Stuart, I'd like to hear from you next. And could you let us know, where do you see agriculture and agri-food fitting into the overall transition into a low carbon economy?
Well, I'll get it started, but others who know more than I will jump on, I hope. Hi, everybody. Yeah, to build on what Tom said, agriculture, as folks know, really faces two big challenges and opportunities in the next decade or two. One is to accelerate economic growth, as the Barton report and others recommended, to access growing global markets, but particularly important for Canada as oil and gas is likely to flatline and maybe even decline over the next 20 years, so as an economic driver in the country. At the same time, though, the challenge of reducing CO2 emissions as the world moves to a net zero economy. Those two goals are often seen as competing, that we have to pick between the environment and the economy, but it doesn't have to be that way. It is possible to do what's called decoupling economic growth from emissions. We've seen that in other regions, other sectors. Ontario reduced its emissions over 20% over a 12-year period, while its growth kept pace with OECD countries on GDP. Many European countries have done even better, achieving 30% or more reductions over 10 to 20 years while still growing steadily. So it is possible to decouple. And to do it, though, really takes the right policies. It takes smart policies that unleash that innovation in the right direction. And that's what we've been working on with AAFC for the past 2 years, as Tom said. This isn't just about doing the right thing for the environment, though. It's also a great marketing opportunity for Canada. If we can position ourselves as a global sustainability leader in a world that is increasingly going to demand low carbon performance, that could really unlock market opportunities for us. We've seen that shift happen in other sectors in a big way. It's happening now in oil and gas. It's happened in forestry. We're seeing it in vehicles. We've seen it in energy. It's beginning to happen in agriculture. Maple Leaf being the first one to go carbon neutral. We see McCain, Unilever, Loblaws, and others making similar moves. And so this opportunity is only going to grow, and we should get ahead of that curve. We're starting to. The agriculture sector is making progress. In the past decade or so, its CO2 emissions have stayed relatively steady while the sector is growing. So we've achieved what's called relative decoupling. If you think of graphs, our emissions have stayed like this, our economic trajectory is like this. That's a good start. But we now have to move to what's called absolute decoupling, where the emissions are going down while economic growth is going up, as part of helping Canada get to our Paris target of minus 40% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. Up to now, I would say agriculture is the sector that's had the least amount of attention in Canada's climate policy agenda. I was struck last December when I looked at Canada's federal climate plan, which is a great plan. But when you look at the different sectors, every sector of the economy is projected for significant reductions by 2030, including oil and gas. And agriculture is the only sector that isn't. It's projected to stay steady. As a policy researcher, that's a really cool opportunity because we know there is a lot that can be done in agriculture, and it's a great opportunity to develop those policies to drive decarbonization. But we can start by looking at the kinds of policies that have worked in other sectors, particularly market-based approaches that spur innovation. They don't just use heavy-handed regulation to say you must cut emissions. They look at things like trading, offsets, and market-based incentives that give flexibility and create economic motivation. As Mike said, that's our specialty at Smart Prosperity. For 15 years, we've built what is Canada's largest green economy research network and think tank with over 100 researchers from around the world and a strong staff. But we recognize agriculture is a bit different. We need a mix of carrots and sticks, and that's what we've been working on. We've looked at things like payments for ecosystem services. It was great to see that in the budget. But how can you combine that with more behavioral economics approaches, nudges that we've heard about? How can we use creative approaches to insurance so farmers that try new things don't face risks? All those things and more are what Ryan Tugas-Cook is going to talk about in a second. Ryan is a research associate at Smart Prosperity. He's got a great background in business, economics, environment, and agriculture. He's done a lot of schooling, some of it at U Ottawa. But he's also got a personal background in agriculture himself. So his feet are in the ground on this stuff. So Ryan, let me turn it over to you to say more about what we've been doing and where we're going. Thanks, folks.
Great. Thanks very much, Stuart. Isabel, would you be able to put the slides up? Perfect. Thanks very much. So thank you everyone again for coming to today's webinar. My presentation today is going to provide a little bit more detail on our recent report, Clean Growth in Canada's Agriculture and Agri-Food Sector, and present some of the key messages. Next slide, please. So one of the main motivations for this work, as we've heard, was exploring opportunities for reducing the environmental impact of food production while also growing farm productivity, essentially what's known as clean growth. Clean growth is really important for Canada's agriculture sector due to several factors that we've heard about already, such as the world's population growing to 10 million people by 2050, the expected increase in the middle class, and the expected increase in the demand for meat, as well as Canada's economic strategy sector tables setting really ambitious domestic sales and export targets for 2025. At the same time, Canada's made commitments to reduce the environmental impact of the agriculture sector and has dedicated a lot of recent programming to helping the sector transition to more environmentally friendly practices. And as Tom mentioned, agriculture sector already takes up over 10%, about 10% of Canada's total emissions. Next slide, please. So to identify how we can unlock clean growth, Smart Prosperity Institute held a workshop in January 2020 that attempted to identify areas of Canada's agriculture and agri-food sector that would be able to help meet both economic and environmental goals. In tandem, we explored a set of policy options that could be used to support these clean growth focus areas. Participants at our workshop showed the most support for nitrogen management, circular economy approaches, and soil health as the areas that can help us unlock clean growth. Livestock emissions, ecosystem service approaches, and assessing the suite of business risk management practices received less support from workshop participants, but were still considered to be an important part of advancing clean growth. However, participants did not feel that next generation crop production technologies like CRISPR offered as much promise in meeting some of these goals. We don't have enough time to talk about all of these areas today, but I'll provide some context and some of the workshop participant feedback on a few of the high-level priority areas. Next slide, please. So starting with soil health. Soil health was selected as an important focus area because it has the ability to offer significant environmental benefits and to contribute to farm productivity. Healthy soils support high crop yields and good crop quality, while also providing benefits like nutrient and water retention, which can help protect water quality by reducing runoff and also provide some adaptive benefits in the face of climate change against things like drought and extreme temperatures. Managing lands to conserve soil organic carbon is another means of improving soil health while also mitigating GHG emissions. However, recent trends indicate that cropland carbon sequestration in Canada is in decline, as the most recent national inventory report shows cropland net removals have declined by over 50% since 2005, and only removed about 4.2 megatons in 2019. Improving soil health can be done in a number of ways, like diversifying crop rotations, cover cropping, and using conservation tillage practices. These and other practices will be essential for supporting clean growth and ensuring that Canadian farms can withstand climate change impacts. Next slide, please. Nitrogen management was arguably one of the most prominent potential focus areas, and we've dedicated quite a bit of research to this topic in other reports in this program line. This is in part because nitrous oxide emissions from synthetic and organic fertilizers represent about 56% of agricultural soil emissions and about 18% of total agricultural sector emissions. In particular, nitrous oxide emissions from synthetic nitrogen fertilizers has nearly doubled compared to 1990 levels. Participants felt that nitrogen management practices were applicable to many of Canada's major cropping systems, like corn, soy, wheat, canola, or potatoes, and that programs like 4R nutrient stewardship offered promise for advancing clean growth. I won't dive too much into the practices here, as we have a representative here to talk about nitrogen management later on our panel. Next slide. The next prominent focus area was beef and dairy livestock, which contributed about 94% of enteric fermentation emissions and 57% of manure management emissions in 2019. Finding ways to reduce these emissions is pivotal, given the expected increase in the demand for meat and the growing size of the middle class. Workshop participants felt that animal genomics, such as selecting cattle that display a high feed conversion efficiency or low methane emissions, and feeding strategies showed the most promise for advancing clean growth. Preliminary results from the University of Guelph's Efficient Dairy Genome Project have suggested that breeding animals for increased feed efficiency and reduced methane emissions can lower feed costs by $108 per cow per year and decrease overall methane emissions by an estimated 11 to 26%. However, genomic practices were viewed as more of a long-term solution that was better suited for achieving longer goals like those set for 2050, whereas livestock feeding strategies such as using feed additives or improving forage quality offered a more immediate solution to curtailing livestock emissions and supporting clean growth. Next slide, please. After identifying some of the focus areas that can help us unlock clean growth, we wanted to know which sets of policy instruments could be useful in supporting these focus areas. These include things like behavioral nudges that address participant inattention, the choice of messenger, and leveraging social norms in program design and messaging. Creating voluntary ecological certification schemes where the producers are able to command a price premium for environmentally friendly food, or using targeted agri-environmental subsidies like reverse auctions and spatial targeting, and also offsets for greenhouse gases, water quality, and biodiversity. Once again, we don't have time to go through all of these options, but I'll provide some additional details on a few of the ones that we've really examined with this program line. Next slide, please. So one of the main reasons why behavioral nudges are so promising is that they have the potential to motivate behavior change without using financial incentives. Studies have shown that using something as simple as a reminder letter to address inattention can motivate farmers to participate in agri-environmental programs. One study found that sending invitation letters and using personalized empathy messages doubled the application rate in the conservation stewardship program at a cost that was equivalent to 2.5 to 5 cent increase in the annual per acre payments in the program. It's really unlikely that a 2 to 5 cent increase in per acre payments would motivate many new farmers to apply to the program. And this shows that nudges can offer a cost-effective and novel way to support participation in clean growth programming. Next slide, please. There are also ways to combine financial incentives with nudges, such as using a collective adoption bonus payment. One study out of France shows that social norms can be leveraged by offering a per acre payment for practice change and an additional per acre payment in the future, conditional upon a certain percentage of producers within the region or watershed adopting the practice within a specified time frame. This type of payment scheme increases farmers' expectations of others in their area to participate and also promotes knowledge sharing among farmers within the region or watershed. Although this type of scheme is yet to be implemented, choice experiments with farmers have shown that farmers prefer contracts or programs with collective incentives, and that collective bonuses can increase the amount of acreage farmers are willing to enroll. Next slide, please. Next is a reverse or conservation auction. This is where there's only one buyer, typically the government or an organization, and multiple bidders, typically farmers. The government identifies the environmental benefits that they wish to buy, and farmers submit competitive bids to implement the practices necessary to achieve those environmental benefits. One of the main benefits of reverse auctions are that they can act as a price discovery tool. Setting the appropriate level for a subsidy payment can be difficult, and it may not always reflect the heterogeneity in the actual cost to the farmer across different production systems and in different regions. The reverse auctions allow the farmer to specify the level of compensation they would need to be provided in order to provide the selected environmental benefits. Reverse auctions are most effective when there are lots of participants bidding and when the bids are ranked according to an environmental benefits index. Some literature has suggested that compared to fixed payment schemes, reverse auctions can result in cost savings ranging anywhere from 16 to 315%. Next slide, please. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about offset systems. Offsets are a form of tradable credits that can be purchased by an organization to compensate for certain types of environmental harm. There are existing offset markets, however, many do not include agricultural practices, which represents somewhat of an untapped opportunity. Offset credits would provide producers with access to new sources of revenue for the adoption and use of sustainable practices, which would increase the private benefits associated with practice change. The federal government's greenhouse gas offset system could be a great opportunity for the agriculture sector, as enhancing soil carbon is expected to be part of the first phase of protocol development. The publication of final regulations is expected to be released later this fall, making it an instrument to keep an eye on in the coming months. Offsets can also be designed to benefit water quality. One Ontario example is the South Nation Conservation Authority Water Quality Trading Program. Here, the Conservation Authority acts as the broker, selling offset credits to water treatment facilities within the watershed. They then use the income from the sale of the credits to promote the adoption of phosphorus management BMPs among local farmers. Over the 9 years that the program was in effect, 269 projects were able to be completed. Next slide, please. So thanks once again for everyone coming today. I'll just reiterate that Canada is on the verge of an extraordinary growth opportunity. And by focusing on things like nitrogen management, circular economy approaches, soil health, and beef and dairy livestock emissions, we can achieve Canada's environmental and economic goals. Certain policy tools like behavioral nudges, targeted subsidies, offsets, and certification schemes will be the way that we can help advance clean growth through these focus areas. For any other questions on this report or program line, I've put my email at the bottom of the slides. Please feel free to reach out. And with that, I'll turn it back to Mike.
Thank you so much for that, Ryan, and the discussion of some novel instruments here. It's a lot of food for thought. Pun, dad joke not intended, but I am a dad, so I guess I can get away with it. So now I'm going to introduce our sort of gold ribbon panel here. So we have first up Brent Preston, Director of Farmers for Climate Solutions. We have Clyde Graham, the Executive Vice President of Fertilizer Canada. Sonia Patel, the report co-author and research associate with me here at the Smart Prosperity Institute. So we'll have our panel, and then we'll have Stewart, our executive chair, give some final words. So my first question is to Brent. Brent, at SPI, we realize that we need to rely on and support Canadian farmers to achieve clean growth. From your perspective, being a farmer and working with so many other farmers, can you tell us about some of the main barriers or concerns that Canadian farmers face when trying to use new environmentally friendly practices on their farms?
Sure, thanks, Mike. So one of the sort of obvious barriers that come to mind is cost. You know, a lot of these environmental practices have a cost to implement for farmers. Often, you know, the research shows that many of the practices that we're talking about eventually create direct private benefits to the farmer. It's actually cost effective over the long term to implement a lot of these things. But in the short term, there's risk and there's cost associated with taking on a new practice. And you know, this is in the context of Canadian farmers who many of whom are already in a fairly precarious financial position. It's a tight margin business, and even a small upfront cost can make the adoption of a new practice really expensive, whether it's purchasing equipment or buying seed, or the risk of a yield loss if things don't go according to plan. So I think that's the most important barrier. But there are also barriers that I think flow directly out of public policy in Canada. The first is that we no longer have a public extension service or public system to disseminate knowledge to farmers and to help farmers learn about new practices. On our farm, my wife's originally from Vermont. We regularly contact the University of Vermont for extension advice to their extension service. We talk to Cornell University all the time when we have questions about new practices on our farm, and we do not have a place in Canada to go to for that information. Much of the information farmers receive now on new practices come from people who are employed by input companies, and so they're not always the ones who are pushing environmental practices. And then there's the question of public support for environmental programs in Canadian agriculture. Research that Farmers for Climate Solutions has done in cooperation with Smart Prosperity Institute shows that our competitive jurisdictions are spending far more than we are on agri-environmental programs. So in the US, they're spending on average 13 times more than Canada on a per acre basis on agri-environmental programs. And in the EU, it's the number 73 times more. So it's not an even playing field. The fact that we have so little public support for agri-environmental programming in Canada and for public extension, I think is a big part of the problem.
Thank you, Brent, for that wrap up where we're hearing both risks and bottlenecks, but also solutions and what's going on in other jurisdictions. So I want to focus a little bit more on solutions. So I'm going to transition over to Clyde. It's clear that nitrogen management will be a big part of clean growth in the agriculture sector. So in your opinion, what are some of the most promising nitrogen management practices, whether they are currently available or in development, for supporting environmental sustainability and positively impacting farm productivity?
Sure. Well, thanks very much. You know, I think there are a number of individual practices or BMPs that have been identified, particularly related to improving nitrogen management and reducing nitrous oxide emission losses. And these include things like enhanced efficiency fertilizer products that reduce the conversion of fertilizer in the soil to nitrous oxide, but even older tried and true technologies like soil testing, subsurface application of nitrogen fertilizer, in some cases split application where you're not putting all of the fertilizer down in the spring, but you're adding some during the growing season to maximize the uptake of the fertilizer by the crop. But we tend to take a very holistic approach to management of all fertilizer, and not just nitrogen, but phosphate and potash and sulfur and other nutrients. And that's through our 4R nutrient stewardship program, where we encourage farmers and their certified crop advisors or other extension workers to put together a fertilizer plan that's based on the right source of fertilizer or other nutrients at the right rate, the right time, and the right place. And we think it's important that all 4 of those areas work together to maximize the fertilizer that goes into the crop and for production, and minimize the losses to the environment, whether that's N2O or loss of phosphate to water, or even leaching of nitrogen into soil and groundwater. And so we've been working on this for more than 15 years. We've invested a lot of time and energy into the program, working with provincial departments of agriculture and departments of environment. We worked closely with AAFC on research. We've worked with grower groups and with the scientific community. And we found it very important that scientists at universities of Alberta, University of Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Guelph, Dalhousie have all done research work that we've contributed to verify that the 4R practices, particularly probably about half that work has been on reducing N2O emissions. And we've seen very positive results that those emissions can be reduced by 15 to 25% at a very conservative level. And in some cases, we might be able to reduce those emissions by up to 50% as well, which we're talking at that point of megatons of annual reduction in carbon equivalent nitrous oxide emissions reductions. And so, you know, I think that I would just add that, you know, this is a very difficult problem because Canada feeds the world. I mean, not all the world, but we are an important player in exporting food to countries around the world. And in many cases, the farmers are selling their crops to countries that are still developing, and that where Canadian food production is an important part of the diet. And you know, the calculation is roughly that 50% of all the food production in the world depends on fertilizer, not just nitrogen, but phosphate and potash as well. So the balance between food production, cost-effective and affordable food, and emissions reductions is definitely a complex one.
Well, fantastic. So while I got here, I'd like to add a follow-up. So this was a great summary of what Fertilizer Canada has been doing, but obviously government plays a role here. So, you know, what are the types of policies or programs would you like to see implemented in the next agriculture policy framework to support the adoption of the practices that you mentioned?
Well, I think the Smart Prosperity Institute report lays out some very interesting options in that area. You know, we believe that the most productive policies are going to be ones that encourage farmers to adopt 4R nutrient stewardship practices rather than you know, regulation or things that are more coercive. I think that some of the important things that we'd like to see as components of that is for government policies to focus on emissions intensity. You know, our view is that where the focus really needs to be on reducing the carbon footprint per unit of grain being produced or oil seeds. And because it is really tough to get absolute reductions in nitrous oxide emissions without reducing food production itself or driving up the price of food. We think that the federal government could do more to recognize the importance of 4R nutrient stewardship in its programs and policies, as most of the provincial agriculture and environment departments have done. And I think that's important because we need to get 4R nutrient stewardship recognized as a valid sustainability program internationally because of the important questions of market access and how stakeholders around the world will view the sustainability of Canadian farming. I think in terms of specific initiatives, what we focused on really is offsets, allowing for payments to go to growers that are doing the right things in terms of their carbon footprint by when they use fertilizer. And I think that can be both through government sanctioned offsets or through the voluntary international carbon offsets that we are seeing increase. I think one last thing that's somewhat technical but very important is we need to fix the National Inventory Report as it addresses the measurement of nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer use. We think that the report doesn't take into account modern agricultural practices and doesn't really resonate with 4R nutrient stewardship. We are working closely with AAFC on this issue, but it's important. Very hard to measure nitrous oxide. The quantities that can have an environmental impact are very, very small. It can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to set up a sophisticated measurement program on just one field. And so it's going to be very important that we come up with scientifically defensible and valid measurement and estimates of our nitrous oxide emissions if we're going to demonstrate that what we're doing is actually working to reduce emissions.
Well, fantastic. Thank you for that. So you've given us a few. So I'm going to now go to Brent to return to the farmer's perspective and ask pretty much the same question. What do you see as the top 2 to 3 changes, such as new programs, policies, or funding opportunities that Farmers for Climate Solutions would like to see included in the next agricultural policy framework?
Sure. I think that at the very top level, I should start by saying that Farmers for Climate Solutions has released a set of 4 high-level recommendations for the next agricultural policy framework. We're in the middle of a campaign this week in advance of the federal, provincial, and territorial ministers meeting next week, pushing these priorities. But number one is really to have a target, that we need a target for emissions reduction in agriculture and a comprehensive plan to hit that target. So, Mike, as you said at the beginning, off the top, I'm not sure who said it. It might have been Stuart saying that agriculture is the only sector in Canada that is not projected to have significant emissions reductions by 2030, and I don't think farmers want to be in that group. We don't want to be the only sector that isn't contributing to emissions reductions. So we need to start with a strong target. I think the target of 30% reduction in fertilizer-based emissions that the government released is a really great start, and we need a target like that for the whole sector. And I'm going to disagree a bit with Clyde. I don't think intensity-based targets are going to cut it. The national targets we have in Canada are for absolute reductions in emissions, and we need absolute reductions in emissions from the agriculture sector if we're going to contribute to that transition. And I think there are lots of pathways to have absolute reductions in emissions and still maintain growth in yield and profitability for farmers. And then the next priority that we're calling for at Farmers for Climate Solutions is to have the next APF really target direct support to farmers to reduce emissions. The way we're going to move the needle on emissions in Canadian agriculture is by one farmer at a time, changing practices on their farm to reduce their emissions at the farm level. And we need policies in the APF that are going to support that transition at the farm level. And then finally, more specifically, business risk management programs we haven't talked a lot about today, but they take up the lion's share of funding in the APF. And we think that those programs need to be modified and adjusted in order to ensure that they're contributing to this climate transition. We get lots of anecdotal evidence from farmers in our networks about BRM programs right now that don't allow practices that we know reduce emissions. So, Agri-Insurance in some provinces won't allow intercropping. They won't cover certain cropping systems that include cover crops. The agricultural insurance program, crop insurance program, makes it difficult to implement some of these programs. So we want to make sure that we don't have disincentives in the BRM programs to climate-friendly agriculture, and preferably building in incentives so that farmers who are addressing the climate risk on their farm through better practices are rewarded by lower rates or better access to BRM programs.
This is great. I always love when we have some agreement and some disagreements on panels. And I am very tempted to ask our third panelist to be the tie-breaking vote on intensity targets, but that is not her area of expertise. So instead, I will ask her something about her area of expertise. So Sonia, we briefly touched on circular economy in agriculture in the report, but I'm certainly interested in, and I think our audience is as well, in hearing about how the Canadian agriculture and agri-food sector could become more circular. So could you give us a few examples of how Canada's food systems could become more circular?
Yeah, for sure, Mike, thanks. That is a great question, and probably one that requires its own dedicated session to answer, but I'll try to highlight a few in the time that I have. Before I do that, to folks who are unfamiliar with the concept of the circular economy is an economic model emerging globally as an alternative to our current take, make, waste linear economy. In the context of the agriculture and agri-food sector, this model propagates designing out waste and pollution, and that's both organic and inorganic waste, keeping our agri-food products in their highest and best use for as long as possible, and producing food in a way that regenerates natural systems. Ryan and I think Clyde too have already touched a little bit upon the regenerative practices, so I'll focus more on the designing out waste and pollution bit. This is really a big challenge for Canada. A recent study suggests that almost 60% of the food produced annually in Canada gets lost or wasted across the food value chain. That is a lost value of close to $50 billion a year. Most of this ends up in landfill, where it then contributes to methane emissions. What's worse is that while on the one hand, we have all this food waste, on the other hand, at least 4 million Canadians are reportedly food insecure. So circular thinking and practices offer a pathway to resolve some of this. SPI's recent work, which my colleague will post in the chat, has uncovered at least 30 different possible practices that can help move the system towards more efficiency and circularity. This includes practices which both help reduce food loss and waste, and where that isn't possible, use that as a really valuable and somewhat untapped feedstock for new food and beverage products, animal feed, soil additives and fertilizer, biomaterials like bioplastics, high-value biochemicals, as well as biofuels and bioenergy. In another piece that we were recently commissioned to do, we actually did a landscape scan of Canadian businesses and organizations that are applying these practices. And encouragingly, we found close to 200 really innovative food solutions across the country. So I'll highlight a few now. One of them is Trendy Tech. These folks are based in BC, and they've developed this mobile processing unit driven by AI and machine learning that can actually go right to the source of where food is wasted, rescue it while it's at its freshest, and then convert this into a dry material. This can then be used to feed people, animals, it can be converted into a soil amendment, as well as has uses in several industrial applications. So imagine the value that can be generated by deploying these units across Canada, especially in the remote regions. Another really great one is Livestock Water Recycling, an ag tech company based in Alberta. They've designed a solution for manure management market. So their technology can separate manure into nutrients and clean water. The water can be recycled on the farm, while the nutrients can be used to create a fertilizer, which can either be used on the farm or sold as an additional revenue stream. So another great solution there. And these are just a very small snapshot of what is happening and what is possible in Canada. And if any of these have piqued your interest, I really encourage you to go to our website and look through some of our publications on the agri-food circular economy.
Well, thank you for that. So I obviously I encourage everyone to look at what we've done, but our work isn't going to be complete there. We've got more coming out, and I know Sonia, you're working on a really hard on a new report right now. So I'm wondering if you could, 60 to 90-second kind of spoiler about your new reports and about the policies and programs that will be required for the shift to a circular economy.
For sure. So I mentioned there are a whole lot of practices that can be applied to accelerate the transition to the circular agriculture and agri-food economy, and many of these are being seen in Canada. However, most of these are operating on this relatively small scale and achieving only incremental change. So for a truly circular agriculture and agri-food economy, we're going to need a more systemic rethink of our production and consumption practices, which in turn, as you mentioned, will require strong government support. Our very preliminary research in this space suggests that this support will need to span the entire innovation chain, and Stuart touched on that a little bit as well in the beginning. So we need policies and programs that encourage more ideation. Then there's the policies and programs to support businesses who are working in the space. That's through financial instruments like grants and loans, but also very importantly, non-financial supports like advisory services. Then there's the policies and programs that can actually help stimulate the market for these circular products and services. This can be done in a variety of ways, including through regulation, pricing tools like taxes and fees, like Stuart touched upon, and also through government procurement, which is governments have this huge power of procurement, which they can leverage to sort of incentivize these products. And finally, there are some tools in their arsenal that can support the system as a whole. So for instance, by setting more inclusive and shared guiding visions, following that up with strategies, setting measurable targets, building and facilitating more partnerships in the space, investing in skills, training, infrastructure, and putting in place the monitoring and accountability measures. That was a lot to cover in a very short period of time, but I hope it gives a sense of the sort of complete policy suite that is required to drive this transition. We will be publishing an interim report later this month that summarizes some of these tools. If you're interested in that, please stay tuned.
Fantastic. So again, keep an eye on our website to see all the great work that our agriculture and circular economy teams are producing. So Sonia, you name dropped Stuart, so I'm going to give him the floor now. So Stuart, after hearing the sentiments from the other panels, what do you think are the next steps? Where should SPI turn its focus to ensure that some of these policies and programs actually end up in the next agricultural policy framework?
You asked Tom Rosser that question. I thought you were going to ask me to break the tie, Mike. I'm glad you didn't. So I'm going to start not by trying to cover it, but just by, I looked at the first Q&A on the website, and I encourage others to start filling that up. There's one in there right now, but throw in some more. And it really said, are all these policies going to pay farmers, or are they going to have to do this as volunteers? And I got to say that question is music to my ears, because that's what we work on at Smart Prosperity. We recognize that farmers, like all of us, have multiple motivations. Some of them are personal. We want to do the right thing, but they've also got to stay in business and earn a profit. And so what we work on is how do we get our personal and our economic motivations moving in the same direction? How do we use market-based approaches? And most of the things Ryan talked about, whether it be payments for ecosystem services, targeting insurance programs to reward environmental stewardship, offsets, they are all programs that do just that. They actually create an economic incentive for doing the right thing, so farmers aren't forced to choose between their conscience and their wallet, because that's a tough place to be for them, or frankly, for any of us. But I guess I'd also add, as Ryan said, that farmers are not just, economics isn't all that motivates them. And so things like information, peer-to-peer learning, encouraging experimentation, these kind of softer nudge approaches, when you mix those with the economic ones, you can actually see much greater results. And I would say just moving from the kind of individual farmer to the whole sector, this shift isn't just kind of a nice boutique issue. It really is essential to the sector's future economic well-being. I mean, I've seen firsthand that sectors don't really see how quickly this shift towards markets demanding environmental performance can happen. I was on the Oil Industries Advisory Council about 6-7 years ago, and most of the companies there, while they thought about the environment, they didn't see it as core to their business case. Boy, has that changed now in a few years, right? They recognize that their economic survival depends on really ratcheting up their environmental performance. Automakers, same thing. You won't be able to sell a gas-powered car in 10 years. That certainly gets the blood flowing. And forestry went through the same thing 15 years ago, where markets just demanded a massive shift in their practices, and frankly, they didn't see it coming. They're a great example because they turned that threat into an opportunity. They actually got ahead of it and say, okay, we're going to move from being seen as an environmental laggard to an environmental leader. And over the course of 5 to 10 years, they really shifted their whole business model, and it paid off. Canada's opened up market access in forestry by having that shift, and agriculture can do the same thing. But we have to take seriously that shift will happen. As Brent said, having the agriculture sector as the only sector not targeted for emissions in our climate plan is really a reflection that we haven't taken seriously that this shift is of fundamental economic importance to the sector's viability going forward. So let's open it up to more questions, but recognize this isn't just about the environment. This is about the economic well-being of farmers and the whole sector.
Well, absolutely. And again, I love the sort of focus on the opportunity because there is a really big one here. So I've got a question here for Ryan, and I'm going to pick on him because we haven't heard from him in a while. Our question is, someone, first of all, said they really liked the report and really liked the inclusion of behavioral economics in the analysis and describing incentives for farmers to reduce emissions and adopt sustainable production practices. So Margaret would like to know, how can the incentives and policies and programs be customized to address the different risk profiles and preferences of farmers, as well as the different regional aspects of farming with different soils, climate, commodities across countries? Who should deliver these programs by provincial level, commodity associations? So there's a whole lot of questions in there, but I think they're all really important. So I'll let you, Ryan, pick the part of the question that you've got the best answers for.
Yeah, of course. I think just touching on the risk profile, we didn't really touch on it in the presentation, but one of the things we really look into here is Bmp Insurance. I don't know if you're familiar with the program. It's something that was recently adopted by the USDA, and it gives producers the opportunity to adopt the practice and then set up a strip of regular conventionally managed land and a BMP strip, and it allows the farmer to test out the BMP on their own. And I think it would help address a lot of the risk profile because it allows them to do their own trial in person. And then it also kind of addresses some of the heterogeneity in different production systems and across different climates, because the BMP, setting up the test strip that uses the conventional practices, allows them to compare against the conventional yield in that specific region. So I think programs like that are something that we would really look into going forward. And I think that it could be delivered at either the federal or the provincial level. I think there's a tie-in with some of the current business risk management programming with that Bmp Insurance type of policy.
Fantastic, thank you. So here's this is a jump ball. This can go to anyone. It's about nature-based solutions. A lot of work that we do here at SPI. Unfortunately, most of that team is not on this call. But Peg wants to know, how can incentives for ecological services and biodiversity be developed to support management for carbon? So I'll open that up to anyone, Brent or any of our panelists. Would you like to take that one?
Okay.
Sure. So I'm not sure I'm understanding the question exactly, but I think with incentivizing practices that are going to increase carbon sequestration or encourage carbon removals from the atmosphere, there are lots of different ways to do that. and I think but I think it's important to take a whole farm approach, because there are often practices that can, for example, increase soil carbon sequestration, but may cause other emissions in other parts of the farm or increase those emissions. So it's important to remember that when we're talking about agriculture, it's a little bit different because we're talking not just about carbon, but also about carbon dioxide, but also about methane and nitrous oxide, as we've talked about today. So we really have to look at the whole sort of the whole range of greenhouse gas emissions from the farm and try to design our programs to ensure that we're not increasing one while we decrease another. I don't know if that's helpful for that question or not.
No, that's incredibly helpful. I understood it, so I think if I did, everybody probably did. So in about the 90 seconds we have left, I got a question for Clyde, and it's a very straightforward one. What's next for the 4R program?
What's next? Do I have my mic on? Here we go. Learning how to turn my camera on. That's what's next. Yeah, I am very optimistic that the 4R program is at an inflection point in Canada. I think we can't take our foot off the gas, although I know we all want to use less gasoline, but I think we are at a bit of a tipping point and we just need to continue going. Some of the optimistic things are the Canola Growers Association of Canada have set a target of having 90% of canola acres in Canada under 4R nutrient management by 2025, and that is a remarkable number because canola growers also grow wheat and pulses and other crops, and really it's a huge amount of farmland that would be involved if they're able to achieve that level. The Saskatchewan government has set a target of having 25% of all the farm crop production acres in Saskatchewan, which is our biggest area of farmland in the country, under 4Rs again by 2025. So there's a lot of good things that are happening. We've had a lot of support by provincial governments. AAFC has done a lot to support the scientific evidence that's required to give farmers confidence that the 4Rs work. And so I guess I kind of try to stop at an optimistic point of view that I think a lot of good things can happen if we all continue to work together.
Well, that is a fantastic way to end. So thank you, Clive. A lot of the good things can happen if we all continue to work together. So thank you, everyone on this call for working together with us. And you name dropped AAFC. So a big thank you to Tom Rosser for sharing his insights with us, and to our panelists as well. Thank you to Ryan and Sonia, Clyde and Brent. And thanks everyone for joining us today. We hope you've enjoyed today's discussions. We would invite all of you to read the report, Clean Growth in Canada's Agriculture and Agri-Food Sector. And I'm going to use the final few seconds to plug our next event. Join us later this month. We have a 3-part webinar series exploring the intersection of health, nature, climate, and the economy. The first event kicks off next week on November 10th. So please sign up. And as well, in the chat box, you see that there's a short survey, so you can share your thoughts on this event. So again, my name is Mike Moffat. I'm the Senior Director here at Smart Prosperity, and thank everyone for attending today. See you later.